Chapter 10. Jane Goes to London. Neither Jane nor Elizabeth was comfortable on the subject of Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Even Elizabeth began to fear, not that Bingley's feelings had changed, but that his sisters and the amusements of London would be successful in keeping him away. Jane wished to hide her anxiety, and never mentioned it, but an hour rarely passed without some remark from her mother which it needed all Jane's patience to bear in silence. Mrs. Bennet was really in a most pitiable state. She was continually thinking about why Mr. Bingley had not returned. Then, too, the sight of Miss Lucas was hateful to her. She regarded her with jealous dislike as the wife of the future owner of Longbourn. Whenever Charlotte came to see them, Mrs. Bennet imagined that she was thinking of the time when she would take possession. Jane had written to Miss Bingley, and in a little while a reply arrived and put an end to doubt. The first sentence announced that they were all settled in London for the winter, and the letter ended with a brother's sadness at not having had time to say good-bye to his friends before leaving. Hope was over, completely over. Elizabeth's heart was divided between sympathy for her sister and anger against the others. Secretly, she blamed Mr. Bingley for his weakness in being persuaded by his sisters, and she was angry because she believed that Mr. Darcy had helped to influence him. Jane bore her sorrow with gentle sweetness, and tried to believe that she had only imagined Mr. Bingley to be fond of her, and that she had only herself to blame. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual from London to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanly man, of much finer character than his sister, and Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet, was a pleasant, intelligent, well-dressed woman, and a great favourite with her nieces. The first part of Mrs. Gardiner's business on her arrival was to give her presents and describe the newest fashions. When this was done, she had a less active part to play. It became her turn to listen. Mrs. Bennet had many troubles to tell, and much to complain of. 2 of her girls had been on the point of marriage, but nothing had happened after all. "I do not blame Jane," she continued, "but Lizzie, oh sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins's wife by this time, if it had not been for her own bad character. He made her an offer here in this room, and she refused him. The result of all this is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have. It is very bad for my nerves to be annoyed so by my own family, but your coming at this time is the greatest of comforts, and I am glad to hear about the new dresses." When Mrs. Gardiner was alone with Elizabeth afterwards, she spoke on the subject of Jane. "Poor Jane! I am sorry for her, because with her character she may not recover for some time from such a disappointment. But do you think that she could be persuaded to go back to town with us? A change of scene might be of help to her." Elizabeth was extremely pleased with this proposal. "I hope," added Mrs. Gardiner, "that no thought of this young man will influence her. We live in such a different part of the town, and mix with such a different class of society, that she is not likely to meet him unless he really comes to see her." Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, and the Gardiners left Longbourn after a week's stay. Before she went, though, Mrs. Gardiner, who guessed from Elizabeth's behaviour her feelings for Wickham, gave her a word of advice. "Seriously, I would advise you to be careful. I have nothing to say against him. He is a most interesting young man, and if he have the fortune that he ought to have, I should think that you could not do better. But as it is, you have sense, and we all expect you to use it. You must not disappoint your father." January and February were dull months. Elizabeth missed Jane sadly. Charlotte was married and had left for Hunsford. There was little except the walks to Meryton, sometimes muddy and sometimes cold, to help pass the time. Elizabeth wrote and received many letters. She exchanged news with Charlotte as regularly as ever, but their friendship could never be as close as it had been before. From London, Jane wrote that she had neither seen nor heard anything of Miss Bingley, but she accounted for this by supposing that her last letter to her friend had by some accident been lost. "My aunt," she continued, "is going tomorrow into that part of the town, and I shall take the opportunity of visiting Caroline." She wrote again after she had made the visit. "I did not think that Caroline was in good spirits," were her words, "but she was glad to see me and cross that I had given her no notice of my coming to London. I was right, therefore. My last letter had never reached her. I inquired after her brother, of course. He is so busy in society that they hardly ever see him. My visit was not long, as Caroline and Mrs. Hurst were going out." Elizabeth shook her head over this letter. 4 weeks passed, and Jane saw nothing of Mr. Bingley. She could no longer be blind to Miss Bingley's inattention. At last the visitor did appear, but the shortness of her stay and the change in her manner no longer made it possible for Jane to deceive herself. It was plain that she received no pleasure from coming. She made a slight formal apology for not visiting her before, and said not a word about wishing to see her again, and was in every way so unfriendly that Jane decided not to continue the acquaintance. To Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth wrote of her own affairs. Wickham's attentions to her were over, and he was now the admirer of Miss Mary King, a young lady whose grandfather had just died and left her £10,000. Elizabeth's heart had been only slightly touched, and her pride was satisfied with believing that she would have been his only choice if fortune had permitted.